The restaurant had been closed to the public for the evening, its crystal lights dimmed to a private glow reserved for power, money, and the kind of conversations that shaped markets before the world even knew decisions had been made. At the center of the room sat a long table dressed in quiet luxury. Investors spoke in low voices. Assistants moved carefully along the edges, and at the head, the billionaire CEO checked his watch for the third time. Tonight mattered. This wasn't just another corporate dinner. His father was coming. Old world. Old values, Sicilian pride that didn't bend for wealth or status. If the evening went well, the investors would see strength, tradition, legacy. If it didn't, they would see weakness dot behind the scenes. Tension moved faster than the servers. Only the best staff on the floor, a supervisor whispered. No mistakes tonight. At the service station stood the newest hire. She kept her eyes down, hands steady, movements quiet. A young black waitress, barely a week into the job. Observant, careful, invisible in the way people became. When they learned early that attention often brought judgment. She's too quiet for Viper, another server murmured. Does she even know fine service? Someone else added. She heard them, she always did, but she said nothing, because silence had taught her something powerful. Watch first, speak later. Then the doors opened, the room shifted instantly. The CEO stood. Investors followed. An elderly man entered slowly, posture straight despite his age. Eyes sharp, expression guarded. His presence carried something money couldn't buy, authority built from history, struggle, and a lifetime of refusing to be impressed. This was the man whose approval still mattered. The CEO greeted him in formal Italian. The father nodded, politely, but his eyes kept scanning the room, watching, measuring, and somehow, they stopped on her. The supervisor hesitated, then reluctantly gestured. You, take the table. For a brief moment, her hands tightened around the tray. Then she walked forward. Step by careful step. No one expected anything from her. Not the investors, not the staff, not even the CEO, who was already turning back to business. She stopped beside the father, for a heartbeat. She said nothing. Then, softly, respectfully, she spoke. In Sicilian. The words were warm, traditional, not textbook Italian, not rehearsed phrases. Home language. The room went silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses paused in mid-sentence and glasses paused in mid-air. CEO turned slowly, because even he didn't speak that dialect. The old man froze, his guarded expression cracked. Then something deeper appeared. Surprise, recognition, and emotion he hadn't shown all evening. He answered her, also in Sicilian. Her reply came naturally, effortlessly, not performance, belonging. Investors stared. Staff stopped moving. Power had entered the room hours earlier, but now something else had. Connection. Respect, and the quiet waitress no one wanted on the floor was suddenly the only person the most important man in the room was looking at. The CEO forced a smile. But confusion was already creeping in, because the evening he had carefully controlled was no longer moving according to his plan, and the attention that was supposed to be on him had shifted. But what no one in that room knew was why a quiet waitress from the kitchen spoke a language even the CEO barely understood. The CEO recovered quickly. That was what he did best, control the moment, protect the image, keep the narrative clean, polished, predictable. He stepped forward with a practiced smile, guiding his father toward the head of the table as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside, something had shifted, because the connection he had just witnessed wasn't strategic, it wasn't managed, and worst of all, it hadn't come from him. Around the table, investors were already watching more closely now. Not just the father, not just the dinner. The room. The star. The details. Because in rooms like this, power wasn't measured by what went right, it was measured by what slipped through. Behind them, the floor supervisor leaned toward another server. I told you she wasn't ready for VIP, he whispered, minutes earlier. He had tried to move her to the back. She's new, she's too quiet. We need confidence on this floor tonight. But they were short-staffed. The table was filling. There was no time to argue, so she stayed. And even now, as she moved carefully between chairs, there were eyes on her. One guest watched her place a glass. You sure she knows what she's doing? He murmured to the CEO's assistant. The comment was quiet, but not quiet enough. She heard it. She didn't react. No apology, no nervous explanation, just steady hands, because she had learned long ago. Competence speaks louder when you don't defend it. At the head of the table, the father wasn't watching the investors. He wasn't impressed by the wine selection or the presentation. His expression remained reserved, almost skeptical, as business talk began flowing around him. Numbers, expansion, brand, positioning, corporate language that sounded efficient and empty. To him, tradition wasn't a marketing angle, it was identity. And identity wasn't something you polished for investors. Then she approached again, this time to take his order. She spoke to him quietly in Sicilian. Not formal, not rehearsed, respectful, familiar, natural. The change in him was immediate. His shoulders relaxed, his voice softened when he answered. He asked where she was from. She answered. Simply, he nodded. Not as a customer, as someone, acknowledging another person who understood something deeper than service around the table. Conversation slowed. Because the warmth he hadn't shown his own son all evening. He was showing her, the CEO noticed on, and for the first time that night, his smile tightened. This dinner was supposed to reinforce authority, legacy, control. Instead, the most important relationship in the room was forming outside his script. Investor eyes shifted between father, son, and the quiet waitress who had somehow reached a place influence. Couldn't buy, she wasn't trying to impress anyone, she wasn't performing, and that made it impossible to manage. The father looked at her again, this time longer, studying her, measuring something beyond service, beyond language, beyond the moment. Then he spoke. A question, simple, direct, in Sicilian, and as she paused to answer, every conversation at the table faded, because when the father asked her one unexpected question, that dinner's entire power dynamic began to shift. The father's question was simple, but it carried weight. How did you learn our language? He asked it in Sicilian, his voice calm but intent, as if the answer mattered far more than the business plans waiting on the table. For a moment, she hesitated. Not out of fear, out of habit. Because her story wasn't something people usually asked to hear. Around them, conversation slowed. A few investors leaned back. One set down his glass. The CEO shifted slightly in his chair, expecting a quick, polite response so the evening could return to its agenda instead. She answered carefully. My grandmother raised me, she said, softly, still speaking in Sicilian. She worked for a Sicilian family when she was young, many years ago. The father's eyes sharpened. She lived with them, the waitress continued, cooked for them, took care of their children. They treated her like family. She never forgot that. The room grew quieter. At home, she spoke the dialect every day, she said. Not to teach me, just because it reminded her of people who showed her kindness. A pause. I learned by listening. The father leaned back slowly, his expression changing again, not surprise this time, but recognition. She went on, her voice steady but humble. When I got older, I started writing the words down. I wanted to understand the grammar, the history, how language carries memory. An investor whispered to the person beside him, this is powerful. She didn't hear them. I studied linguistics in college, she continued. I wanted to specialize in regional dialects, how communities keep identity alive through language. The CEO blinked. That wasn't in her employee file. She kept her eyes lowered. But my grandmother got sick. I had to leave school to work. This job helps pay for her care. No self-pity, no performance, just facts. Silence settled across the table, the kind that doesn't come from awkwardness, but from people realizing they had been looking at someone without really seeing them. The father nodded slowly. To learn a language for respect, he said quietly, not for advantage. She answered with a small smile. She always said language is how you tell people their story matters. Across the table, investors were no longer checking their phones. They were watching her, listening, because the conversation had shifted from expansion strategies and quarterly projections to something investors rarely saw in boardrooms. Authenticity, heritage, meaning. At the head of the table, the CEO felt the shift more than anyone. The dinner was supposed to center around leadership. Authority. Instead, attention was moving toward a story he didn't control, one that made his carefully crafted presentation feel distant, even hollow. His father looked at the waitress. Again, longer this time. There was emotion in his eyes now. Respect, pride, something deeper than approval. Then he spoke again, his voice lower, more personal. In Sicilian, the words were brief, but the moment they reached her, the color drained from her face, her breath caught, and across the table, the CEO sat up straight, because whatever his father had just said had changed everything. The father's words, spoken in Sicilian, were quiet, but their meaning carried across the silence that followed. "You learned our language to honor someone else's story," he said, his voice steady. "That is respect. That is education. That is character." He turned slightly, no longer speaking just to her. Now he was speaking to the table. "This young woman understands culture better than many executives I have met." The statement landed like a shift in gravity. Investors glanced at one another. A few sat up straighter. At the head of the table, the CEO forced a polite expression, but the tension in his shoulders gave him away. Baker's praise from his father did not come easily. And tonight, it wasn't directed at him. The father leaned forward, folding his hands. "In your presentation," he continued, now addressing his son, "you spoke about expansion into southern Italy." The CEO nodded cautiously. "Yes, we're planning a major launch in the region next quarter." The father turned back to the waitress. "Then I would like to ask you something." The room went completely still. "What do you think?" For a moment, she didn't move. A server asking for water would have felt more normal than this. Every eye in the room was on her. Investors, executives, the CEO. She hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect for the weight of the moment. "I'm not part of the company's strategy team," she said carefully. The father gave a small nod. "I didn't ask for a strategy," he replied. "I asked for your perspective." She took a slow breath. Then she spoke. "If the campaign focuses only on growth and market share," she began, "people may see it as another corporation coming to take, not to belong." A few investors leaned forward. "In southern Italy, community matters more than scale," she continued. "Families remember who respects their traditions and who treats their culture like a brand asset." The CEO's expression shifted. That hadn't come up in the last 3 consulting reports. "If the messaging feels polished but distant," she said, choosing her words carefully, "it could come across as tone-deaf, even disrespectful." "Silence, not disagreement, consideration," she went on, gaining quiet confidence. "It might help to partner with local organizations, support cultural events, use regional voices in the campaign. Let the community see that you're investing in them, not just expanding into them." One investor nodded slowly, another whispered, "That's smart." At the head of the table, the CEO felt something tightening in his chest, because what she was describing wasn't just thoughtful, it was better. Better than the expansive frameworks, better than the polished language, better than the strategy deck his team had spent months preparing. The father leaned back, watching the reactions around the table. "People don't resist companies," he said calmly. "They resist being treated like markets instead of communities." No one argued, because the quiet waitress standing beside the table had just reframed the entire expansion conversation. The power in the room had shifted, not through authority, not through position, through insight, through respect, through understanding something that numbers couldn't measure. Investors were now looking at her, the way they had been looking at the CEO an hour earlier, evaluating, listening, taking her seriously. And for the first time that night, the CEO realized something unsettling. The most valuable voice in the room didn't work in his executive office. She worked on his service floor. The father watched his son for a long moment. Then he stood, and what he did next would change her life and the company forever. Dinner ended with polite applause, careful handshakes, and the quiet hum of investors discussing what they had just witnessed. But the real conversation began after the room emptied. In a private corner of the restaurant, away from staff and guests. The father stood facing his son. The CEO spoke first. "She's impressive," he admitted, keeping his tone measured. "But tonight was unusual. We can't turn one moment into a policy decision." The father didn't respond immediately. He studied his son the way he had when he was younger, not judging the words, but the thinking behind them. "You hire degrees," the old man said finally. "I look for character." The CEO exhaled. Slowly, "This is a global company. We have processes, structure, people earn their roles." The father nodded up, double quotes. "And yet," he said, "a waitress understood your market better than your strategy team." Silence. "She understands people," the father continued. "That is power. Markets change. Technology changes. People do not. CEO looked away, jaw tightening. This isn't just about insight, he said. There are optics. Internal hierarchy. If word spreads that we're pulling service staff into advisory conversations, it creates confusion. The father stepped closer. No, he said quietly. It creates loyalty. Before the CEO could answer, 2 investors approached. We couldn't help overhearing part of that discussion. One of them said carefully, "For what it's worth." Her perspective was the strongest cultural insight we've heard on the Italy expansion. The other nodded. If you're serious about community positioning, bringing her into a cultural advisory role wouldn't just be good strategy, it would be a powerful message. The CEO felt the pressure shift again. This wasn't just his father anymore. This was investor interests, reputation, narrative, opportunity, across the restaurant. She was finishing her side work, stacking glasses with careful hands. No one had spoken to her since the dinner ended, and the silence was growing heavier. Had she said too much, crossed a line? Servers weren't supposed to speak unless asked, and even then, not like that, not to investors. Not about company strategy. Her supervisor passed by without meeting her eyes. It didn't help. By the time she changed out of her uniform, her stomach was tight with worry. People with power didn't like being corrected. People with power didn't like being surprised. And she had done both. The next morning, her phone rang before her shift. It was the restaurant manager. "The CEO's office wants to see you," he said. No explanation, no reassurance, just a time. When she arrived at headquarters, the building felt colder than the restaurant ever had. Glass walls, quiet hallways, people who walked like they belonged. She sat outside the executive office, hands folded, heart steady but heavy. She had already decided what she would say. An apology for speaking out of turn, for overstepping, for forgetting her place. The assistant opened the door. "He'll see you now." She stood, took a breath, and walked inside. Because when the CEO finally called her into his office that morning, she was preparing to apologize. Instead, she heard something that left her speechless. The office was larger than she expected. Glass walls, city skyline, the quiet weight of decisions made at levels she had never imagined entering. The CEO stood when she walked in. That alone surprised her. "Thank you for coming," he said, motioning for her to sit. She didn't. "I just want to apologize," she began quickly. "For last night, I spoke too much. It won't happen again." For a moment he simply looked at her, then he shook his head. "No," he said calmly. "That's not why you're here." She hesitated. "You didn't speak too much," he continued. "You saw something we didn't." The words landed slowly, carefully. "You understood the culture behind the market," he said, "and you explained it better than a room full of consultants." He stepped around the desk and placed a folder in front of her. "We'll offer you 3 things," he said. Her hand stayed still. "First, full tuition support so you can finish your linguistics degree." Her breath caught. "Second, paid training in cross-cultural communication and community engagement." She blinked, processing. "And third," he said, watching her reaction, "a part-time role as a cultural consultant for our southern Italy expansion." Silence filled the room. Not the awkward kind. The kind that comes when a life changes faster than your emotions can catch up. "I don't have corporate experience," she said quietly. "You have perspective," he replied. "That's harder to teach." When she finally nodded, it wasn't excitement that showed first. It was relief. Weeks later, the results began to show. The expansion campaign was rewritten, less corporate language, more local storytelling. Partnerships were formed with regional cultural groups and community organizations. Local events were funded. Before product launches, instead of announcing their arrival, the company began by listening. Community response shifted. Then media attention followed. Articles highlighted the company's authentic cultural approach. Analysts called the strategy unusually grounded. Inside the company, something else was changing. Managers who once overlooked frontline staff began asking new questions. Listening sessions were introduced. Employees started sharing hidden skills, language abilities, and community connections no one had ever asked about. The story spread internally, not as a headline, as a lesson. The quiet waitress was now attending strategy meetings, and when she spoke, people listened, not because of her title, because she had been right. The distance between the service floor and the executive level began to feel smaller. Bias didn't disappear overnight, but it cracked, and through that crack, possibilities started to grow. Yet for all the internal change, the biggest moment was still coming. Because the real turning point, the one the world would see, wasn't happening in a boardroom. It happened weeks later, during a public event. And when it did, the moment didn't just impress the audience, it went viral. The launch event in southern Italy was designed to be polished, controlled, and carefully managed. A historic town square, local officials, community leaders, cameras positioned for the perfect corporate narrative. The CEO stood at the podium, delivering a speech about partnership, investment, and long-term commitment. The words were strong. The message was clear. The crowd listened politely. Then his father stepped forward. The old man didn't look at the cameras. He looked at the people, and then he said something no one on the communications team had planned. "There is someone here," he said slowly, "who understands your culture better than any presentation we prepared." He turned toward the side of the stage and motioned for her. For a moment she froze. This wasn't part of her role. She wasn't a speaker. She wasn't an executive. But the crowd began to clap as she walked forward, quiet and composed, the same way she had walked across the restaurant floor weeks earlier. The microphone felt heavier than expected. She didn't give a speech. She didn't talk about strategy. She spoke in Sicilian, just a few sentences. She thanked the community for their history, their traditions, and their willingness to welcome people who were willing to listen first. For a heartbeat, the square was silent. Then the crowd erupted. Applause echoed off the stone buildings. People stood. Some called out in dialect, smiling, nodding, recognizing something rare in corporate events. Respect. With and out. Video clips began spreading online. Waitress becomes cultural advisor. Why humility beats hierarchy. What happens when companies actually listen? Comments flooded in. People shared their own stories of overlooked skills, hidden talents, moments when someone from the margins changed the outcome. Others praised the company for doing something unusual, elevating perspective instead of just credentials. The story traveled far beyond Italy, and with it, the company's reputation shifted. Analysts called the approach authentic. Community leaders called it respectful. At the next press briefing, the CEO was asked directly about the moment. His answer was simple. "She reminded us that leadership isn't about titles," he said. "It's about understanding people." Validation had moved from a private dinner to a global audience. The quiet voice that once worked unnoticed behind the scenes had become a symbol of something larger. An underdog story, bridge between cultures, proof that humility could outperform hierarchy. But the biggest change wasn't happening online. It was happening inside the company itself. Inside the company. The effects of her voice began to ripple quietly, almost imperceptibly. At first, human resources revised hiring protocols. Resumes mattered less. Character and perspective mattered more. They looked for people who could see, listen, and understand. Tuition programs were expanded. Employees who had paused education to support family or work were invited back. Learning was no longer a privilege for the few, it became a promise to everyone. Departments held listening sessions. Staff shared hidden skills and talents they had long kept to themselves. Languages spoken at home, cultural knowledge, experiences previously ignored all became valuable. The CEO walked the halls differently. He reflected privately, wondering how he had managed only resumes for so long, ignoring the human intelligence that had been in front of him all along. Meanwhile, she moved through the office with growing confidence. He contributed ideas in meetings, guided colleagues on cultural insights, and mentored others. Yet she remained humble, grounded, never forgetting the floor she had started on. Her father's words echoed in her mind from that first dinner. Respect opens doors, money never can. And it was true. Respect had shifted power. Respect had rewritten hierarchy. Respect had unlocked opportunity that titles, suits, and strategy decks could not. Employees who had once felt invisible now felt seen. Management who had relied on authority alone now listened. Conversations that were once transactional became human. It was a subtle revolution, invisible to the outside world, yet more profound than any viral video or news headline. Because in the end, the moment that froze the room wasn't about language at all. That night, in a quiet corner of a crowded restaurant, a lesson unfolded that few would ever forget. 3 truths became impossible to ignore. First, Talent often hides behind quiet voices. The woman who had moved through the floor unnoticed, underestimated by staff, dismissed by guests, suddenly commanded the attention of the most powerful men in the room. Ability doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits, patiently, for someone to listen. Second, respect crosses every cultural boundary. Language, tradition, heritage, these are bridges, not barriers. She didn't flaunt her knowledge. She offered it gently, humbly, and it carried further than any title or credential ever could. Respect drew connection where authority alone could not. Third, power isn't position, it's perspective. The CEO, polished and practiced, realized that influence isn't won through hierarchy or control. It is earned through insight, understanding, and the courage to speak truth when others expect silence. The contrast was stark. The heroine embodied humility, preparation, and dignity. She understood herself, her history, and the people around her. The systemic villain, the assumptions, the hierarchy, the obsession with image remained powerful, but it was flawed. It could be outmaneuvered by something far simpler, far more human. Wisdom coupled with courage. Across the nation, in the viral clips and news headlines, people saw the moment, but there was more to it than a story about a waitress speaking Sicilian. Imagine how many voices go unheard in boardrooms, classrooms, and dinner tables every day. How many leaders overlook insight simply because it doesn't come packaged with prestige or expectation. She had no intention of proving anyone wrong. She simply honored what she had learned from her grandmother, from life, from respect itself. And in doing so, she reminded everyone in that room and everyone who later watched online that value is rarely obvious at first glance. A shy waitress, a forgotten dialect, a room full of power frozen by respect, because sometimes the quietest voice in the room isn't the least important, it's the one powerful enough to change everything.